Welcome back to the panel discussion, Innovation in Government, Cyber Leaders on Cloud Security, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. My guests today are Jonathan Fibus. He's the Chief Information Security Officer with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Andre Mendez, he's the CIO, the Chief Information Officer at the International Trade Administration Bureau, Department of Commerce. Katie Lewin, Federal Director, Cloud Security Alliance. And Ned Miller, he's the Public Sector Business Unit Sales Executive for mVision Cloud at McAfee. Before the break, we got into some interesting dialogue regarding people and the role that people play in all of this, because we talk about things that essentially support any kind of activity that the government or any agency is engaged in when it comes to security, but none of it is completely automated. There is a process, a place for the human involved. And Andre, you mentioned, the activities and the engagement, the way in which humans do their work in this process. And Ned, I want to go to you first to ask you this question. We've heard for years from first the National Counterintelligence Executive, now from the National Counterintelligence and Security Center Director Bill Evanina, about these things or these steps that need to be taken to make sure that people are doing the right thing to protect their agency and organization from risk. But it still keeps happening. So how do you address that? What are your suggestions?
So one of the key areas that we often talk about is the notion of insider threat, right? And what that really means. And it aligns to the concept around user behavior and how do we provide a continuous monitoring capability for what our users are doing, what data they're accessing, why they're accessing that data, and how they're using the data. As we move to the cloud, the complexity of being able to do that has changed quite a bit over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. So now we have to look for ways in which we can help our agency customers monitor their user behavior as the users are interacting with one another using simple tools like collaboration tools. So as an example, we have data that is now traversing cloud to cloud. How do we ensure that we know what the users are doing with that data? We're passing around very large PowerPoint files, we're passing around spreadsheets, proprietary data in some cases, and as a result of that, we need to have due care for that data set as it's in the cloud. It's a very different model. Think of it as data loss protection for the data that resides cloud to cloud. It's a whole new model that we have to look at from a threat vector standpoint.
But I guess a more fundamental question, and anyone on the panel feel free to answer or jump in on this, and I'll get all of your responses. A more fundamental question, though, is maybe not how many more procedures can you put in place or fail-safes can you put in place, but how do you actually change the behavior or the thought process of those people who might be at risk for accidentally or purposely not or doing the wrong thing when it comes to this?
So from our perspective, from a pure technology viewpoint, the systems now are actually cautioning the users on their behavior. So you set policies up that if a user is quote unquote out of guidelines or out of bounds, there will an alert pop up on their screen that suggests that they change their behavior.
Hey, so don't do that.
Please don't do that. And that's being nice, right? So my guests on the panel probably have some relative experience here.
I would say two things. One is because the generation that's coming up now that are really the majority of the users are much more cognizant of privacy, they live in an environment that I certainly wasn't brought up in, but they were. It's all automated. They know pretty much what they are entitled to, and they try to keep their privacy and under wraps. So the Cloud Security Alliance has a conference every year in DC, and we always have a segment on culture, because there is a misunderstanding of what it means to have your data in the cloud. I would say that it's more secure than if you have your own data center under your desk, which happens a lot. But in fact, that people have to understand what the cloud actually is, how your actions can be both monitored and protected. So a lot of it is education. And you're not going to be speaking to people who are going to say, what's an ATO? Because these people, both who work in this environment, are going to be more educated because that's the way they grew up.
And what I hear from you is the younger people that are coming into this system and
Right.
situation now have been hearing this and have been seeing this for a much longer period of time than we adults who had to make a sea change essentially in our careers. Let me go to Jonathan first and then to Andre.
So I hear from people a lot that they just want to do their job, and sometimes the technology, sometimes the cloud gets in their way. And Katie is right, culture takes time. So we have a lot of user education segments. We are trying to build awareness. We have monthly sessions where we talk about cybersecurity issues, and not just about cybersecurity at work, but things that users may see at home and try to relate them all together. So if you're secure at home, you're more secure at work, and you understand why I can't copy this down to a thumb drive, or why maybe I shouldn't mail it to my personal email address. Mm-hmm. You're right, it comes down to the person, and education is our best tool at this point.
We are pretty granular right now. I want to go back up to the 30,000 foot level, but Andre, I want to get your thoughts first. I want to hear what you have to say, but then I want to talk to you about the cybersecurity strategy point of view and what you think is necessary at this point. But first, you had something to say about this.
Well, actually, that was going to the 30,000 foot level.
Take it there.
Because the biggest problem we have is resource availability, right? And so when we are dealing with a restricted number of resources, we need to make sure that we absolutely and completely focus on what is the value added for the specific agency, that being functionality or security or whatever other category you want to apportion it to, right? And so the reason why, the cloud environment makes so much sense is because effectively you build a continuous number of abstraction layers that you no longer have to worry about, right? And so even within the cloud, there are various ways in which you can implement cloud, and some of them are even more advantageous than others. If you use infrastructure as a service, right, you're going to find yourself still having to patch servers, to manage servers, and do all of those things that go on, except that the servers are now in the cloud, they're virtual environments, rather than being in your own backyard, in the room next door, or as you mentioned, under somebody's desk that you don't even know about. Right, so you have some degree of control over that because every single machine that is provisioned, you know exactly what it's doing, right, and you can monitor it. But the other fashion in which we are leveraging the cloud is with software as a service, which to me is immensely more powerful, right? Because then you totally and completely abstract everything else that is happening except the application itself, which is where you're going to derive the value for your agency that allows it to fulfill its charter. No agency has been created to administer SQL servers, not a single one of them, right? No agency has been created to administer patching onto a virtual farm. Agencies have been created to do what they're supposed to do, and that is all at the application layer. So the moment that you're able to abstract all of that and focus on that and focus all your resources on that, you can do so much better job of bringing functionality to the table. You have so much more agility in delivering quick services to the taxpayers that it's beyond belief. I've always found it interesting that people do large scale cost benefit analysis for moving to the cloud. I'm sorry, but when you're looking at running the Le Mans and you have a Fiat 500 or a Ferrari, you're going to choose the Ferrari,
right.
Okay? And so it's basically the same type of comparison. This is all about focus. This is all about using your resources properly and not wasting time with commodity items that somebody can do much better than you, much cheaper than you, and much more securely than you.
And Ned, how do you roll that into a strategy?
So there's three areas that we try to provide stewardship to our customers with respect to best practices around how to engage and accelerate into the cloud. One is to make sure that you've got a handle on what we consider shadow IT. So as Andre mentioned, it's very quickly, customers are able to quickly adapt and acquire SaaS-based services. In some cases, that can be a runaway process. When we do audits on agencies, oftentimes we find that they have many more SaaS applications than what they thought under management.
And how does that happen?
It's a scenario by which it's so easy for services for individuals to go out and acquire services that if there are not ways to monitor sanctioned and unsanctioned services by an agency, you have that shadow IT happening. The second area is what we often would refer to as the data protection model. And again, it's around these collaboration concepts where we're collaborating cloud to cloud and whose responsibility is it. So that shared security responsibility in and among and between clouds is an area that we see as a potential threat vector. And then finally, it's back to the human element that you spoke to before. We see a lot of configuration issues still at the personnel level that are setting up the systems in the first place. Things like at a very granular level, leaving S3 buckets open, et cetera, that all of a sudden everybody has access to the data that they didn't have intentions to do so. So from a best practices standpoint, those are the three areas that we're most concerned about.
Jonathan, go ahead.
And using those additional services like cloud security brokers, I can keep track of who's using what commodity services. I can clamp down a little bit further to make sure we don't get that rogue IT. And we can further leverage the economies of scale in the cloud to get that automation in place that allows us to focus on these small but very important products to make sure our users are behaving the way they need to behave with our data and that the system is doing what it needs to do. So I can take my resources that are very expensive for cybersecurity and I can focus them where they will do the most good for protecting the agency mission.
Go ahead.
Oh, so JJ, I was just going to say, I'm here for the Cloud Security Alliance, so I would like to mention them, and it's free. It's a free service, and they have great research. So if you're coming in, not as the CIO, because obviously you have a strategy and a plan, but if you're a new security professional and your boss wants you to explore, let's say, putting a function in the cloud that's key to your agency, one of the places you can go is to cloudsecurityalliance.org. We have tons of research. It's free. Anyone can get to it, but they have papers that say, what should I look at first? So there are ways besides relying on your contractor who is going to recommend a solution that may be beneficial to both of you. There is a vendor neutral area, Cloud Security Alliance being one, that you can start your education to say what are the first steps to go.
So what I'd like to do now is to ask you a question that I'm sure none of you were expecting today, but I'm going to ask you anyway because I got a feeling that this could be a very productive question. And I'm going to start with you, Andre. You are on the cutting edge of a lot of things and have been for a while, considering where you've worked and where you are now and where you're going. What's the worst problem that anybody engaging in a plan or a strategy right now to nail down their cloud, to put the kind of security in place that they need? What's the worst problem, that the most difficult problem they're going to face today? Because we know the goalposts keep moving because of the adversaries now. So what's the most difficult problem?
I think that if you achieve a successful cloud strategy where you effectively outsource a lot of your security to cloud-based vendors that have been certified, you are left with what is the weak link in all of this, which is the stuff that you actually implement yourself. And invariably, that ends up at the endpoint protection, right? The endpoint protection, it being desktops or laptops or tablets that are floating throughout the world. In the case of the ITA, we literally have installations everywhere. Especially in the dens of the worst cyber criminals in the world, even places like China and Russia and so on and so forth, because we do trade with them. And also in the cell phones that have now, of course, become so ubiquitous as tools of business, and in which a lot of this data also transacts, right? And so we want to take advantage of all those abstraction layers we talked about and focus almost all of our intensity on the endpoint security, right? And on the way to ensure that those particular places are absolutely protected, right? And that they're doing so on a proactive basis. And there are a substantial number of tools out there right now that actually have become incredibly effective of doing so. Almost creating a situation where you have a firewall, totally built inside of your endpoint that mimics the TIC environment that is available out there for agencies to connect through, and that really take you to the next level. I want to go further in terms of the consolidation and actually create an environment where 2-3 years from now, nobody in our agency actually has desktop computers. They all have cell phones that plug into an environment at work where they can have the large size displays and everything else. But now all of a sudden, I'm narrowing the field of protection that I need to provide into one set of tools, one set of instruments, right? And I can focus to the utmost on that and really achieve a very high level of security from an endpoint standpoint, because I am entirely completely focused on that, and I can have a very, very disciplined and managed environment.
Well, you certainly know how to make provocative statements near the end of a segment, but I'm going to ask you right now, since you did that, everybody with a cell phone, do you know what this means? These are big. And how big is this cell phone going to be?
No, it's the same size. It's the same size because
So-
you plug it into a cradle,
Yeah, I
and then you
understand.
have your keyboard.
I understand. I'm talking about productivity. I have a hard time with the cell phone because of that. So
That's
what's-
because we're old, JJ.
Fine. But are you going to go hire all 9-year-olds to do this? So, but
No, but quite honestly, I mean, you look at my trade representatives throughout the entire world, they don't want desktops.
Gotcha.
They at most want tablets.
Gotcha.
But that's as far as they're going to go.
I'm your moderator, JJ Green, on the panel discussion, Innovation in Government, Cyber Leaders on Cloud Security, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.